Just one quick word of personal update that while my title now has changed to Professor Emeritus at Augsburg University in Minneapolis, I'm happy to say I have now relocated back south and I'm back in Columbia, South Carolina, and so it's good to be back. Good to be back in the neighborhood, so to speak. Thank you. It's always good to be here, especially today when we can talk about, or I can talk to you about not what you can expect to find in the letters of Johann Ernst Bergmann, but you can actually now see it for yourself now that the book is out and available. And so I'm very happy now to have the opportunity to have that conversation with you now that the book is out and available, and also to hear some of your reactions to some of the things that now you're finding in the pages of those letters. Let me just give you, before we get into that though, just a quick update about a couple of other projects. Noble mentioned the transport project, which I've worked on in collaboration with Christina Koch. That book is now being reviewed, or that manuscript is now being reviewed by 2 publishers, and so I hope to have some good news to deliver to you soon in that regard. I also just wanted to say a word about the translation of Dr. Vinda's dissertation, The Early History of the Lutheran Church in Georgia, that is now out, recent development concerning that. Every year, the Concordia Historical Institute in St. Louis, Missouri, gives a series of awards to what they deem to be some of the most significant publications on American Lutheran history in the previous year. And as it turns out this year, Dr. Vinda's book is the recipient of one of those awards. And so that's a very, very gratifying. The presentation of that award will be in November of this year. Dr. Vinda is not able to attend. He is 82 years old now, I understand, but Vince Exley will be attending that celebration in St. Louis on his behalf to receive the award. So that's very appropriate and very, very fitting. Now, over the years, I've had the opportunity to be with you a couple of times, both here and in Atlanta, to talk about things that are in the Bergmann letters. But one of the things that occurred to me in thinking about what we might have a conversation about today, we really haven't spent much time talking about Bergmann himself. Who was he? What does he like? What sort of impression do we have about him from the letters? And so I think I'd like to focus on that today, trusting that some of you already, I know, have had an opportunity to at least look into the letters a little bit, and I'd be very interested in hearing your impressions as well. So you can kind of help me out with this as we go along. But first, just a few things about the background and context for the book itself. With the publication of these letters, of course, we now have available in English the letters of the first pastor of the Ebenezer community, Bolzius, and now the last pastor to have come from Germany, Johann Ernst Bergmann. So it's something like a bookend of that early period in Ebenezer's history, and the comparison and contrast of those sets of letters, I think, is pretty interesting. Clearly, from the time of Bolzius to the time of Bergmann, much had changed in the experience of the Ebenezer community. In Georgia itself, that certainly made an impact on the letters. And so, as Noble was indicating in his introduction, the context really is a good bit different by the time Bergmann arrives on the scene. And he has much to tell us, not just about events and developments within Ebenezer, but really in Georgia, and sharing his impressions on the status of things in early America as well, the early years of the United States. So the style that Bergmann brings is going to be quite a bit different from that of Bolzius. My impression from the Bolzius letters was that he tended to focus pretty closely on events within Ebenezer. Of course, he does talk about things external to the community as he needed to as well. But really a pretty sharp focus on the community itself. Bergmann, of course, does the same thing. He's writing back to his superiors in Germany to talk about things within the community, and there are a lot of problems, as you'll see, and we might have a chance to talk about some of that this morning as well. But Bergmann also is very intentionally concerned to talk about events in the larger context around Georgia and in America. One of the things that he says in his letters is that he does not, while he keeps a personal journal, he does not write a journal that he sends back to Germany as Boltzius has done. So he intends his letters to function in place of a journal. So that, I think, helps to account for why he's not just talking about Ebenezer, but things more broadly as well. In the collection, there are 60 letters total that come from Bergmann himself, and then 2 that come from his son after his father's death. Christoph, of course, was his father's successor here at Ebenezer, although, as we learn in the letters, that was not assumed by any means, not by Bergmann himself. That's also an interesting part of the story, but nonetheless, we do have those 2 letters from the younger Bergmann that help to round out the collection. So fewer letters, but again, because Bergmann is broadening the context a bit, the letters tend to be longer than many of the ones in the Boltzius collection, but they contain more information. Now, of course, I didn't work on this project alone. This happened in cooperation with folks at the Franke Foundations in Halle, Germany, which is where all of the letters in the collection are housed, the original manuscripts. And so I'd like to at least give a nod to my partners in this work. Jürgen Groschel, the archivist in Halle, selected all of the letters and made them available. And also, Jürgen was an indispensable partner with me in helping me with particular questions about translation and also some background information that's important as well. One of the things that came out of this project that Jürgen was able to verify was finally the actual birthplace of Bergmann. We'll see that in just a few minutes. As he was able to examine some church records in Germany and was able to actually find the record of Bergmann's birth and baptism, so answering that question. And also Erika Pabst, who did the transcriptions of the letters. So Jürgen, you have on the handout that you have here something that I think is both interesting and helpful. You'll see a copy of Bergmann's handwriting on the front page. Fortunately, I did not have to read that. As I said, Jürgen identified and collected the letters. Erika Pabst provided the transcriptions of those letters. So here, I suppose this particular transcription may have come from Jürgen. The text that I worked with all came from Erika, that she provided for me by email in electronic format. Boy, wouldn't Bergmann be amazed? I mean, his letters are taking months to go from here to there, and Jürgen and I are exchanging emails in seconds. With information. Anyway, Erika provided the transcriptions for all of the letters, saving me that work. And then, of course, the main task of the translation was mine. So it was really a cooperative effort, and I appreciate very much their their work. I could not have done this without them. So there's a lot of history, of course, between the time of Boltzius and Bergmann. Boltzius, of course, arrives in 34. Bergmann arrives in 86. There are people here who are far better in math than I am. How many years is that? 52. Thank you, 52, yeah. So you can imagine all of the changes that would have taken place here in Ebenezer over that time. An entire generation has passed away. A new generation has arisen. So there are going to be some profound differences in setting and context, as well as personality between Bergmann and Boltzius. That's going to be significant too. You also have in your handout, if you'll take a look at the second page there, I tried to put together for you just kind of give us a visual impression of the amount of time that has taken place from Boltzius to Bergmann, but also to kind of put into context the other pastors in Ebenezer, kind of where they fell within that context. So you can see Bergmann there at the end. I'll say a few things about Johann Probst, the last name that you see there in a few minutes. That's a very interesting part of the story as well. So a lot of things have happened. Certainly for Bergmann, there are going to be two events in Ebenezer's history that are going to have made the most profound impact on the situation by the time he arrives in 1786. Anybody want to take a guess at what those two things are? I'll give you a clue. One is internal and one is external. What's that? Exactly, the American Revolution, which of course, those of you familiar with the history here know that it was devastating to this place, physically as well as communally. So really very dire circumstances here by the time Bergmann arrived. And the second thing, internal to the community, was the dispute between Robinhorst and Triebner. We don't have time today to get into all of the ins and outs of that, but they're not getting along. Remember, Muhlenberg had to come down from Pennsylvania to settle it, and that quelled things for a bit, but the tension never really went away. Bergmann recognized, even though Robinhorst, as you see here, dies in 1776, same year as the outbreak of the American Revolution, Bergmann was very much aware that the impact of that dispute and the splits that it caused in the community, with some lining up with one of the pastors and some with one of the others, continued to have a profound impact on the community. He still saw the results of that split and those factions within the community, and he writes about that over and over and over again. And so decades after that, this doesn't happen today, does it? That congregations have these divisions that continue on for years and years. Yeah. But very much, one thing we learn about Bergmann is he is someone who had a very long memory. Very long memory, and I'll give you some examples of that in just a couple of minutes. But one of the reasons I think he had a long memory was because he recognized just how profound the impact of the past would continue to be into the present, and just how important the past was in shaping the current direction of things. One of the things that I find interesting about what Bergmann does in these letters, I think in some ways it would be fair to refer to him as Ebenezer's first historian, because what we find in his letters are quite often he will go back and recall the earlier history of Ebenezer and give his own evaluation about things, his own judgment about things. And of course, he's hearing most of this secondhand or third hand. He have some records available to him. But it's also, I think, interesting to kind of hear his understanding of Ebenezer's history based on his experience and what he learns about the community. So those two things were very important. And finally, I think it's important by way of background just to understand the circumstances of Bergmann's call. Now again, so for a period of time, you have Rabenhorst and Christoph Triebner, who are the pastors of Ebenezer. Rabenhorst dies in 1776. Things get very difficult for Triebner for a variety of reasons, including his support of the British in the American Revolution. So 1782, he has to leave when the war is over. But he continues to live into what is 1816. And he is still meddling in things going on in Ebenezer. He is still in contact with the superiors in Germany, giving his version of what Ebenezer is all about. He's writing letters to Bergmann, trying to influence Bergmann's role here. It's just a mess. But what that means is Ebenezer is a divided community still in large respect because of the Triebner-Rabenhorst split. The place is devastated as a result of the American Revolution, and there is no pastor to the community. So the leaders of the community contact Henry Melchior Muhlenberg in Philadelphia, who's still sort of the leading figure of American Lutherans at that point, and in fact has been given authority by the superiors in Germany to oversee Ebenezer's affairs. So they turn to Muhlenberg. Muhlenberg there's no one in America already to send, so Muhlenberg intervenes and appeals to Germany for a pastor to come to Ebenezer. So how is it then that the decision falls to Bergmann? Well, before we get into that a little bit, let's take a look at, get into a little bit more about who Bergmann was and what he's all about. So I've got a timeline for you. Turn to the next page there. We don't know a lot about Bergmann, and really all we know is based on what he tells us from the letters themselves, as well as just other bits of information that we can piece together. So what you see here is mainly just taking out of information that he gives us from the letters. It's a pretty skeletal view of someone's life, but in terms of, if we were to ask the question, what are the facts of Bergmann's life that we know? This is pretty much it. But there are some things that we can learn about Bergmann as a person, his personality, his character, by the way that he writes and the way that he deals with things. But let's take just a few minutes, first of all, and just hit some of the, I'm not going to read through all of this. You can kind of just read over this yourself and form your own impressions. But there are a couple of things that are worth emphasizing and pointing out. The main thing to note is that his family was very poor. His father was a school teacher. His mother died when he was very young. It's interesting that Bergmann will, from time to time, mention that his childhood poverty prepared him well for his life in Ebenezer. I think it probably did. But nonetheless, he seemed to have exhibited some academic ability that landed him sort of the equivalent of a scholarship to study, which landed him at the University of Leipzig. As you see here, he refers to this period or experience of spiritual distress after his theological education, though he never says what that was. And what was it that was causing this sort of spiritual uneasiness for him? I have a clue about that. I'll say something in a minute. But nonetheless, he finally makes a connection with the Halle Orphan House, as did all of Ebenezer's previous pastors. Although Bergmann spent the least amount of time in the Halle orphan house as the other pastors did, but nonetheless was very much under the Halle pietistic influence, the influence of pietism, that particular religious direction, theological direction that emphasized not just believing things with the head, but having an experience of Christian faith in the heart that would lead to this sense of conversion, and then a very notable change in life, an authentic Christian life in devotion to God and in service to others. So that mindset is still very much shaping Bergmann and will become important to him when he gets to America as well. Now, a little bit of background here to keep in mind. Remember that throughout this period of Ebenezer's history, that the pastors who came to Ebenezer, they were chosen really by almost a team, you could say. Halle, the orphan house in Halle was certainly involved. The pastors came from the orphan house in Halle. But the person who actually made the selection for the pastor, or was the key person in making the selection for the pastor, was Samuel Erlsberger down in Augsburg. All right, now that's again, we don't have time to get into the details of the story, but he was an important figure in selecting the pastors who would come from Halle. And so this system is still in place when Bergmann is called. Now, by this time, Samuel Erlsberger in Augsburg had retired, but his son Johann had succeeded him as the pastor at St. Anna's Church in Augsburg, and now he took on that role of sort of being the main person selecting the pastor to come to Ebenezer. And Erlsberger had this idea that even though the appeal had come from Eulenburg to send one pastor to Ebenezer, he thought, why don't we send two? And the idea was going back to the original plan with Bolzius and Israel Christian Gronau, remember where Bolzius was the pastor. Gronau assisted him, but his main job was to be the school teacher and the catechist. And so Johann Erlsberger wanted to replicate that plan. And so he actually selected Johann Probst, was the first selection to come in that position of catechist and school teacher. So the position of pastor was still to be filled, and they had trouble finding it. Finally settled on Bergmann as the choice, but here's the thing. Erlsberger had his doubts about that. He didn't seem to be completely confident in Bergmann's ability, and so Bergmann has to go down to Augsburg, where he's going to be ordained by Johann Erlsberger, where he's going to get his orientation about situations in Ebenezer, and he becomes very clear that Erlsberger does not have complete confidence in him. And he's troubled by that. Now remember I said he was someone who had a long memory? Boy, does he remember this. You will find in his letters years later referring back to Erlsberger's lack of confidence in him and complaining about that. So Erlsberger then comes up with the idea that, we decided to send you, so you're going to go. But instead of appointing you to the position of first pastor in Ebenezer, we're going to appoint you to the position of second pastor in Ebenezer. We're going to keep the first position open, and later on the plan is to send yet a third pastor to Ebenezer, who's going to supervise both you and Probst. And so it's under this cloud now that Bergmann is going to sail across the ocean and take on this challenge, knowing that his main sponsor in Germany does not have confidence in him. So he's not real happy. He's not real happy about that. And not only is he not happy about that, imagine the surprise among your ancestors here in Ebenezer when the day comes in December of 1786, and who shows up? Not one pastor, but two. Now, what's the question? Who's going to pay for this? Huh? Because the support, most of the material support for the pastors from Europe is gone. The responsibility for paying the pastor is going to come from, And so the community says, we can't handle this. Remember, the condition that the community is in following the war. And so now there is a question, who's going to go back? Well, it seems pretty clear that in terms of authority and primary position, that Bergmann has the position of pastor here. So Probst is going to have to go, but he seems not to be real happy about that. He's able to support himself for a while by going down to Savannah to preach, but this is simply not sustainable. So finally, after a few months, he leaves. He goes back to Germany. He's not happy either. And we'll find out then from Bergmann's letters that Probst is saying some things that Bergmann's not real happy about, that's further going to put a further cloud on his role and position here. And not only that, but apparently some of your ancestors would have rather Probst have stayed and Bergmann gone back. Now, remember that part of what Bergmann is already concerned about is the split between Triebner and Rabenhorst, dividing the community, and now he is sensing he stepped into this unwittingly all over again. So it's not a very promising beginning for Bergmann. All right, let's move along real quickly. Again, you can see on the timeline some of the events that we know about. His marriage to Catherine Herb from Savannah. There are 4 children, and as was all too often the case, the early deaths of children. The first son, named after Bergmann, died as an infant. 2 of his children survived into adulthood, although one died as a relatively young adult, and then finally the one son, Christoph Friedrich, who succeeded him as pastor. Anybody have any questions about anything at this point? Because I'm about to shift gears here very briefly and just say some things about the character of Bergmann, just to kind of give us an impression about what he was like. As I said, this is really about all we know about him. He does not seem to have traveled very much. In fact, in his letters, as far as I recall, the only time he ever seems to have traveled was to go to Savannah. Now, I'm sure at some point he must have gone over to South Carolina, to Perrysburg, at least a time or two, but he never mentions having traveled at all. So, any questions about, yes?
Was he ever happy about anything?
Oh, you're anticipating where I'm going, so let me hold on to that. That's one of the things I want to get to.
Was he in touch with Bachmann and Charles?
He was not in touch with, Bachmann is going to come a little bit later. His son was. It's going to be Bachmann, in fact, who was instrumental in selecting his son and convincing his son to become pastor at Ebenezer. So his son will. He did have contact with a very famous Baptist in South Carolina, in Charleston, Richard Furman. Furman came and preached at the Baptist Church in Savannah several times, and Bergmann liked Furman very much.
Having put in his letters his unhappiness, what kind of reaction did that have with the people who didn't have confidence in Germany?
Yeah. Okay. I can tell you're all really interested to get to his unhappiness. So let's go ahead. Let's go ahead and get to that. I want to just point out two very quickly two things that I think are important just in general. They're obvious about him, but they're also very important. Sometimes obvious things can be very important in shaping who he was. One, he was German, and you go, well, duh, of course he was. I mean, so were the people here. But by that I mean Bergmann was German in a way that people in the community had already stopped being German. That is, he was coming directly from Germany. People here were already, they had lived through the Revolution. They were part of the American experience. German was still spoken here in this church and in the community, but especially the young people, they weren't wanting to speak German anymore. They were ready to move on with this American thing. And Bergmann he has trouble getting used to that. For Bergmann, Germany is still, the way things are in Germany is for him always the standard. And measuring how things are in America is going to pale by comparison. Politically, religiously, this whole idea of separation between church and state, he just cannot understand. And this idea of American freedom, of all things, is something that he thinks has just gone completely off the rails. People can do whatever they want to, and but he complains about that constantly. Part of that is the pietist in him coming through, because he sees where American freedom leads is different from what he thinks authentic Christian living ought to be about. And so there's a tension there. And so the second thing that's obvious is that he was a pietist, and that's going to shape his response to, because in America there's not going to be one way of being religious, there are going to be many ways of being religious. From extremely radical to denying the divinity of Jesus, and there's a really fascinating story about an encounter between Bolzius and a school teacher in the area. His name was George Fisher. This is 1795, and Fisher subscribed to all of these ideas about American freedom and. Thought that the Bible is just a book of fables, and Christian doctrines are just superstitions, and was teaching that in the schools. And Bergmann, of course, wasn't happy about that. Bergmann, the pietist, and so Bergmann starts apparently saying some things about that. One Sunday, just when Bergmann was done preaching, guess who comes through the back door here? George Fisher and some of his companions, confronting Bolzius here in church, threatening him with a lawsuit. It kind of ends in a standoff, at least that particular incident. But the tension continues. Finally, it happened that Fisher was dismissed from his position, but before leaving the area. In that same year, 1795, at the Christmas Eve service, Fisher and some of his companions surrounded the outside of the building here and were beating on the windows with shutters to interrupt the service. So that's just one example of the kind of thing that Bergmann was having to confront. All right, I need to move over this pretty quickly here. Before we get to his gloominess, something I need to say is he was also very scholarly. Being a pietist did not mean that he was anti-intellectual. What it meant was that he believed that scholarship and learning should be in support of Christian faith and Christian doctrine. So he writes this in 1804. Once something is stated in the Bible, it follows that one has a most sacred duty to believe what has been written. And so he believed that learning, scholarship should be in support of Christian faith and not work against it in the way that someone like Fisher, for example, would have suggested. He kept up as best he could with intellectual developments. He's always asking for books. He's engaging in conversations with theological trends in America and in Europe. And he's also following very closely educational developments here in America. He finds it noteworthy to mention, for example, that a library is being built in Savannah. He notes very carefully the founding of the University of Georgia and the beginning of classes there. And he makes this observation once classes have started at the University of Georgia. He says this, and I apologize to you Bulldog fans before I read this here. On the beginnings of, he says, above Augusta, an academy has been established that received the name Athens. American principles of freedom are taught there above all things to the youth. The academic disciplines are insufficiently taught. In short, people thereupon are educated for the world. So you can see here again this tension between his pietist outlook and so on. All right. So yes, he was gloomy by nature, and he knows it. He says so. He writes, for example, in 1789, "I will not deny the gloom into which I lapse. Melancholy is for me a bitter foe with which I have to fight bitterly." Now, what's instructive is he says this in order to make it clear that all of the things that he's complaining about are not just because he's gloomy. That's not just because of his personality, but because he's got things to complain about. He's got things to be gloomy about, and he's telling the truth here. Now, the question about did that make an impact on the way that people responded then to him? Boy, wouldn't it be interesting to have letters written from some of those folks? But we don't have that. But I can't imagine that it didn't make an impact. This connects with something else I want to mention about his personality in just a few minutes. But yeah, I mean, is there a happy letter in the collection? I can't find one. I mean, they're happy moments. I mean, every once in a while there's a glimpse of something positive and optimistic. But I'm sorry, folks, it's not a happy read in every case. But he's dealing with difficult circumstances. However, he also had, if you read very carefully, at least glimpses of a sense of humor. Now, unsurprisingly, given his gloomy character, there's a touch of sarcasm quite often with things. So, for example, in 1803, this time in America, the revival movement is getting underway. The period called the Second Great Awakening. So that there are these revivals popping up all over the country, camp meetings, people going out in the woods and having these big revivals. Bergmann regrets that he can't attend those because of his own duties, but he does receive reports back from them and reports his judgment about them. So, for example, he writes about those gatherings in 1803. Very many people come together at such gatherings, wicked and good. The preachers split themselves up and preach extemporaneously. They are unconcerned about coherence. They seem to avoid it with diligence. Another time, he reports on an incident here in the community where a girl had gotten lost in the woods and she was gone for several days. And so people were very concerned. There's a member of the community whose name I will not mention here. You can read about it. About whom Bergmann has a very, very negative and critical judgment about his life. But this particular individual knew the woods very well, and he was able to go out and actually found her and rescued her. And Bergmann says about that is the single good deed known about this man. For Christians who weren't the pietists that he was, but believed that true Christian faith could be distilled in particular doctrines that had to be defended at all cost, as Bergmann saw it as the expense of Christian life, Bergmann wrote that adhering to such a strict orthodoxy is like having the Pope in the head. So you get these sorts of glimpses of his. I have to tell you this story. I'm sorry. I'm about to wrap up, but I've got this is too good to pass up. He reports about One of the things, the biggest sin that he thought, not just here in Ebenezer, but in Georgia as a whole, was drunkenness. It was just pervasive and everywhere. And he was particularly harsh. Any Episcopalians here? On the Episcopalian clergy in Savannah. Yeah, and so, I mean, he doesn't report these things to be funny, to be humorous, but I think what he's doing is he writes about them to show that they are ridiculous, and I think that's his point. And so he reports one instance where the Episcopalian preacher or priest in Savannah was so drunk that at a funeral he had to be carried to the graveside. And when he began reading the liturgy, he actually started reading the wedding liturgy. You can't make this up. He was principled to a fault, even when it meant working things to his own disadvantage. That's part of what I think speaks to his, in some ways, to his gloominess. I mean, he would see a gloomy situation, he couldn't gloss it over. When he would confront other people's behaviors, he would just be blunt about that. So he was very principled in some ways. He would refuse to take stipends, even though he was poor. Refused to take stipends for weddings, baptisms, and things like that, because he thought just shouldn't do that. There would be times he would refuse to perform weddings if he felt like the circumstances were not right, and would receive ridicule for that. He would exclude people who were accused of drunkenness from communion. And he reports one time, without saying exactly what the reason was, he excluded the sister of his stepmother-in-law from communion. Didn't say why. But he does write later, "I have encountered bitter opposition, even among relatives." And well, yeah. And so he could also then be very blunt with people and upfront. Now, of course, he's writing letters. He doesn't expect these letters to be written. I think he's probably screaming in his grave over there right now to know that we are here, if he were to know that we are here today talking about the publication of his letters, in which he's being very open and very honest, that he never meant for the ancestors, for the descendants of the people he's writing about to see this. I mean, I've actually had pangs of conscience about this while working on this. So all of which is to say, please don't shoot the messenger here, okay? So when you read things there and it says things that aren't as kind as you might think they should be, I'm sorry. It's just, he's over there. You can deal with that. But the last thing I would say is that's important is that he was faithful, and the way that comes through primarily is, or at least this is the thing that strikes me, was his sense of call to Ebenezer, his sense of call to this place. He was not happy, but he felt like he was called to be here, and so he had an obligation to be here. And actually, this helped him when he was facing opposition. Earlsberger's doubts about him, Triebner's meddling, other things when there would be opposition within the community, I would think largely because people might have found him so abrasive. His position was, I have been called here. And this wasn't arrogance for him. This was his sense of duty and responsibility. From the book, I titled the chapters based on quotes from Bergmann's letters in those chapters. It just occurred to me just the other day when I was thinking about this, that there's really a nice bookend in chapter 1 and in the last chapter of the letters that come from him, because the first chapter, the quote that I chose for that was, I have been called to Ebenezer. And that was something that stuck with him even as he was confronting Earlsberger's doubts about him. I've been called to Ebenezer. It doesn't matter what Earlsberger or others say. I've been called to Ebenezer. And remember, he was supposed to be here for 6 years. He remained for over 37 years, longer than Boltzius was the pastor here. To my knowledge, Pastor Johnson, how long have you been here?
About a year and a half.
Yeah, you got a ways to go yet. But as far as I know, he remains the longest serving pastor of this congregation, I think. I don't know that for sure, but it's easy for me to imagine.
His competitor is Austin.
His what?
Austin. Jacob Austin.
Okay.
He was here for many decades.
Okay. All right. But the quote in the last chapter, Bergmann knows he's approaching the end of his life. He's in very bad health. Remember, he was supposed to be here for 6 years, and he says, towards the end of his life, I have remained at the place of my call. So it's been a difficult time for him, very difficult time. But he has done what he felt like he was called here to do. And so the final thing I would say here would be to ask a question that may be on your minds too. Was he the right pastor for Ebenezer, given all of this? And in some ways it's a moot point because there was no other choice, really. No one available. But I think if we kind of twist the question a little bit, maybe it's hard to know, was he in the end the right pastor for Ebenezer? I think one thing we can certainly say, he was effective as a pastor at Ebenezer and Jerusalem Church. Why is that? Because we're here, and this church is still functioning. Remember the circumstances under which he came in 1786. There was no guarantee of any of that, none at all. But you're here, and that I think is the final answer to that question. And I think it's fitting that Vinda, in his book on the early history of the Lutheran Church in Georgia, ends with Bergmann and his son. It really does close out that phase of the German-born pastors who came here, but really, I think ends the story at a place where now it becomes pretty certain that with Bergmann Jr., with his role here, this church will survive. And the community will survive in some way, shape, or form, not as it was originally envisioned, but nonetheless represented by all of you. I can't tell you how immensely gratifying it's been for me to spend time with these letters, to get to know him in the way that I have, and how delighted I am now that you have that opportunity as well. I don't know if we have time for questions or follow-up discussion, but I'll have to turn to others for that.
Are you going to be around after a while?
Yes, I'll be around, yeah.
I mean, like willing to talk to people?
Sure, of course, Vince.
Dr. Kleckley, is there any evidence that Bergmann ever preached a sermon in English? He conducted the services, I think, right up until the end in German. Did he ever preach in English?
I haven't seen any reference to that, any indication of that. He does mention from time to time a letter that he's written in English. But two things very briefly about that. One is he does seem to have been very insecure about his English. I'm not sure that was completely well placed. I think after 37 years, his English had to have been better than he thought it was. But again, he had this sense of if you're going to preach, you've got to preach in a way that's worthy of God. And if you're going to do that poorly with your language, it's better off not to do it. He also seems to have had this idea, and I think this has been overlooked. Ebenezer is still getting some financial support. There's certain endowments that are in place. That's a very complicated story, but there are certain things that are in place that indicate some resources that are available to Ebenezer, but they have stipulations. And for one of those funds, it was that if this community stops being a German Lutheran community, the funds return to Germany. And Bergmann seems to have had in his mind that the issue of language was connected with that if the congregation stops speaking English, that means those funds go back to Germany. At least there's some indications of that.
A think it's quite remarkable that you had as many people as members of this congregation when he was insisting on using the German language. The
Yeah.
language of the people was clearly English at that time.
Bergmann, he didn't, there was certainly clamoring for people to have services in English, and he noted that some members of the community would go to places where there's preaching in English because they wanted preaching in English. And Bergmann thought they're doing that not out of any sort of spiritual desire, it's just vanity.
Many people did become Methodists and Baptists during that time.
I've heard that. I've heard that, yeah. Well, I've kept you long enough, too long already. Thank you all very much.